It started on a December evening, the kind where the frost bites your skin and loneliness clings to your soul. I sat on the corner of Elmwood Avenue, a place where the world's forgotten gathered. My only companions were a battered tin cup and a threadbare coat I'd found in a dumpster 2 winters ago. Around me, the city bustled, car engines roaring, laughter spilling from brightly lit restaurants, and shoes clicking on the icy pavement. I was invisible to them all, just another shadow in the urban sprawl. Then, she appeared. The car was the first thing I noticed, a sleek, black Rolls-Royce that rolled to a halt mere feet from where I sat. The driver, clad in a tailored suit, stepped out and opened the back door with a precision that spoke of routine luxury. And then she emerged. She was tall, her figure draped in a crimson coat with fur-lined edges, the fabric flowing like liquid fire. Her heels struck the cobblestones with a sharp rhythm, and her hair, dark as the night sky, cascaded in waves down her shoulders. Every step she took seemed deliberate, her presence commanding attention without effort. I should have looked away, gone back to staring at the ground or counting the cracks in the pavement. But I couldn't. Something about her demanded my gaze, and for a fleeting moment, I forgot who I was and where I belonged. She noticed me. Our eyes met, hers a piercing green, like emeralds catching the light. There was something in her expression I couldn't place, a mixture of curiosity and disdain, as if she couldn't decide whether to pity me or ignore me. Most people wouldn't have given me a second glance. She didn't just glance, she stared. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low and smooth, like the hum of a cello. I blinked, unsure if she was speaking to me. "Yes?" "What's your name?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Daniel," I replied, the name sounding foreign even to my ears. It had been months since anyone had asked for it. She nodded, her gaze sweeping over me. "You don't look like you belong here." I laughed bitterly, the sound scraping my throat. "And you don't look like you belong near someone like me." A small smile tugged at her lips, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Fair enough. But I'm curious, Daniel, what's your story?" "My story?" I repeated, unsure if she was mocking me. "You mean the part where I lost everything and ended up here? Or the part where strangers like you ask questions and then walk away, forgetting I exist?" Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened. She crouched down, the hem of her coat brushing the dirty ground, and reached into her bag. For a moment, I thought she was going to toss me a few bills and leave. Instead, she pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and offered it to me. "I don't smoke," I said, my voice flat. "Neither do I," she replied, taking a slow drag. But it seemed like the right thing to do. I watched the smoke curl around her face, the scent of tobacco mingling with the faint trace of her perfume, a scent I couldn't name but knew I'd never forget. "What do you want?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "Maybe I just wanted to talk," she said, exhaling a stream of smoke. "People like you don't talk to people like me," I countered. Her smile widened slightly, and this time, it felt real. "Maybe I'm not like the people you're used to." I didn't know how to respond. She was right, she wasn't like anyone I'd ever met. She seemed untouchable, her world a million miles away from mine. Yet, there she was, sitting on the freezing ground beside me, as if the gap between us didn't matter. We talked for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. She asked questions, about my past, my dreams, the moments that had led me to this place. I answered cautiously, unsure of her motives, but her genuine interest disarmed me. "You're more interesting than anyone I've met in months," she said finally, stubbing out her cigarette on the pavement. "That says more about the people you know than it does about me," I replied. She laughed, a soft, melodic sound that warmed the icy night. "Maybe you're right." The driver, who had been lingering nearby, cleared his throat. She glanced over her shoulder and nodded before standing. "I have to go," she said, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "But it was nice meeting you, Daniel." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to thank her for stopping, for treating me like a person instead of a shadow. Another part of me wanted to tell her to leave and never come back, to avoid whatever strange connection she thought she'd found in me. Before I could decide, she reached into her pocket and handed me something, a crisp, folded note. "For a warm meal," she said, her voice softer now. "I don't need your charity," I began, but she silenced me with a look. "Take it anyway," she said firmly. And then she was gone, her heels clicking against the pavement as she disappeared into the car. The engine purred to life, and I watched as the taillights faded into the distance, leaving me alone once more. I unfolded the note, expecting a bill. Instead, it was a handwritten message. "Sometimes, we find beauty in the most unexpected places." I stared at the words until the cold seeped into my bones, making me shiver. For the first time in years, I felt something other than emptiness, a spark of curiosity, a flicker of hope. Little did I know, that spark would grow into a flame that would consume us both. Days turned into weeks, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. Olivia. Her name lingered in my mind, a melody I couldn't forget. Every night, I replayed our encounter, the way her emerald eyes bore into mine, the warmth of her voice cutting through the cold. It felt unreal, like a dream I'd imagined to escape the monotony of my harsh reality. I didn't expect to see her again, but fate had other plans. It was a crisp January evening when she returned. I was sitting on the same corner, my hands shoved deep into my pockets to fight off the biting wind. The streets were quieter than usual, the post-holiday lull leaving the city subdued. Then I heard it, the familiar sound of heels clicking against the pavement. I looked up, and there she was, wrapped in a navy trench coat with a scarf draped elegantly around her neck. Her hair fell in loose waves, framing her face in a way that made her look even more striking than I remembered. "Hello, Daniel," she said, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Olivia," I replied, her name tasting foreign yet familiar on my tongue. "You remember me," she said, almost teasingly. "Hard to forget someone like you," I admitted, surprising myself with my honesty. She laughed, the sound light and genuine, and sat down beside me without hesitation. I noticed how out of place she looked, this woman, polished and perfect, sitting on a dirty curb next to a man society had discarded. Yet, she seemed completely at ease. "I wanted to see how you were doing," she said, her voice softer now. "Why?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. She hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you," she finally said, her eyes meeting mine. "You're different, Daniel. And I don't mean because of your circumstances. There's something real about you." Her words caught me off guard. I wasn't used to anyone noticing me, let alone seeing something worth remembering. "I'm just a guy trying to survive," I said, my tone guarded. "And I'm just a girl trying to make sense of my world," she countered. "Maybe we're not so different after all." We talked for hours that night, sitting on that curb as the city carried on around us. She told me about her life, a world of wealth and privilege that felt more like a gilded cage than a paradise. Her father was a real estate tycoon, her mother a socialite who cared more about appearances than anything else. Olivia had been groomed from birth to fit into a mold she despised. "They all expect me to play the part," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "The perfect daughter, the flawless fiancée, the dutiful woman who never questions anything." "Fiancée?" I repeated, the word hitting me like a punch to the gut. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the ground. "Jonathan," she said, almost reluctantly. "He's everything my parents wanted for me, successful, powerful, influential. But he's not what I want." "What do you want?" I asked, leaning forward despite myself. She looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know I don't want to feel empty anymore." Her vulnerability startled me. This woman, who seemed to have everything, was just as lost as I was. In that moment, the distance between us didn't feel so vast. We were two souls adrift, searching for something we couldn't name. As the night deepened, our conversations grew more intimate. She told me about her dreams, the things she'd never dared to share with anyone else. I found myself opening up in return, telling her about my past, a life that had once been full of promise before it all fell apart. "You're stronger than you think," she said, her hand brushing against mine. The contact was brief but electric, sending a jolt through my entire body. I wanted to pull away, to remind myself that this couldn't go anywhere, but I couldn't bring myself to break the connection. There was something intoxicating about her presence, something that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. When she finally stood to leave, I felt a pang of loss, as if a piece of me was walking away with her. "Will I see you again?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. She paused, her expression unreadable. "Do you want to?" "Yes," I admitted, the honesty in my voice surprising even me. She smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Then maybe you will." She disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with my thoughts. But this time, the emptiness didn't feel quite so heavy. She had given me something I hadn't felt in years, hope. The days that followed were a blur of anticipation and doubt. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something far bigger than myself, something dangerous and thrilling all at once. When she returned a week later, her arrival felt like the sun breaking through a storm. This time, she didn't hesitate. She sat down beside me, her hand brushing against mine as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're not going to scare me away, Daniel," she said, her tone playful but firm. "I wouldn't know how to if I tried," I replied, a smile tugging at my lips. And just like that, we fell into a rhythm. She became my escape, and I became hers. We spent hours together, talking, laughing, and sharing pieces of ourselves we'd kept hidden from the world. But as our connection deepened, so did the weight of what we were doing. She was engaged to another man, bound by expectations and obligations I couldn't begin to understand. And yet, every time she looked at me, I saw something that made me believe in the impossible. It was dangerous, reckless, and utterly intoxicating. And I couldn't bring myself to stop. Our stolen moments became the lifeblood of my existence. Olivia, with her elegance and fire, turned my bleak world into something vivid and alive. She wasn't just visiting me anymore, she was escaping with me, diving into a realm where wealth, power, and duty couldn't follow. Each night felt like a gamble, every meeting more reckless than the last. It started innocently enough, shared cups of coffee in dingy diners where no one knew her name, walks through hidden alleys where her heels clicked against the cobblestones like whispers of rebellion. But the innocence didn't last long. One rainy evening, we took shelter in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The rain poured relentlessly, soaking her expensive coat as she laughed, a sound that echoed through the empty halls. I watched her, mesmerized by the way she seemed to glow even in the dim light. "You look at me like I'm some kind of goddess," she said, stepping closer. "Maybe you are," I replied, my voice barely audible over the storm. She stopped in front of me, her eyes searching mine. "You make me feel like one," she whispered before closing the distance between us. Her lips met mine, soft and urgent, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. I kissed her back, my hands tangling in her hair as years of longing, frustration, and desire poured into that single act. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a breaking point, a line crossed that neither of us could retreat from. From that night on, everything changed. We became lovers, our connection fueled by the thrill of secrecy and the raw intensity of our emotions. She would sneak away from her world of luxury and expectations, finding refuge in my arms. We rented motel rooms on the edge of town, the kind with flickering neon signs and peeling wallpaper. The places were far from glamorous, but with her, they felt like paradise. I traced the curves of her body under the dim light, memorizing every detail as if afraid it would all disappear. She kissed me with a passion that felt desperate, as though trying to escape the chains of her gilded life. "You're my freedom," she said one night, her voice muffled against my chest. "And you're my everything," I replied, meaning every word. But with each moment of bliss came the creeping shadow of reality. Her fiancé, Jonathan, wasn't a man to be crossed. He was powerful, connected, and deeply entrenched in the elite circles Olivia belonged to. The more time we spent together, the more I feared what would happen if he ever found out. "You don't owe him anything," I told her one evening as we lay tangled in each other's arms. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "My family expects me to marry him. They've built this whole future around us, business deals, alliances, everything. Walking away would destroy it all. But what about you? I asked, my fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. What about what you want? She turned to me, her eyes filled with a mix of love and anguish. You're what I want, she said. But wanting you doesn't make it easy. We both knew the risks we were taking. Every time she slipped away to see me, she lied to Jonathan, her family, and everyone in her orbit. Each kiss, each touch, carried the weight of 1,000 consequences. But we couldn't stop. Our love was a fire, burning bright and fierce, consuming everything in its path. I tried to convince myself that we could make it work, that love would somehow be enough to bridge the chasm between our worlds. But deep down, I knew we were running out of time. One evening, as we sat on the rooftop of a crumbling building overlooking the city, she turned to me, her expression unusually somber. He's starting to ask questions, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What kind of questions? I asked, my stomach twisting. Where I go. Who I'm with. He's suspicious, Daniel. The weight of her words pressed down on me like a heavy stone. What are we going to do? I don't know, she admitted, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I can't lose you, but I don't know how to keep this going without him finding out. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly as the city lights twinkled below us. We'll figure it out, I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. As the weeks went on, the tension grew. She became more cautious, her visits less frequent. I hated the fear in her eyes, the way she constantly glanced over her shoulder as if expecting someone to catch her. It wasn't fair, she deserved better than a life lived in shadows and lies. One night, as we lay together in a cheap motel, she turned to me, her face inches from mine. Do you ever regret this? She asked softly. Not for a second, I said without hesitation. She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. I wish I could be as brave as you. You are, I told her, brushing the tear away. You're the bravest person I've ever known. But bravery wasn't enough to shield us from the storm brewing on the horizon. We were playing with fire, and it was only a matter of time before we got burned. Each stolen moment felt like a miracle, a fleeting reprieve from the inevitable. I wanted to hold on to her forever, to defy the odds and prove that love could conquer anything. But deep down, I knew the truth. The higher we soared, the harder we would fall. It all came crashing down on a cold February night. I remember the icy wind biting at my face as I waited for Olivia in the alley behind the diner where we often met. She was late, which wasn't unusual, but something about the stillness in the air felt wrong. My breath fogged in front of me as I paced, glancing down the dimly lit street every few seconds. When the sleek black car finally pulled up, my heart lifted and sank at the same time. The door opened, but it wasn't Olivia who stepped out. Jonathan. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed, his tailored coat draped over a three-piece suit. His hair was neatly combed back, his face calm, but his eyes were cold. Calculating. You must be Daniel, he said, his voice smooth but edged with steel. I didn't respond. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. She told me about you, he continued, taking a step closer. Not directly, of course. But I'm a man who pays attention to details. The late nights. The excuses. The way she glowed after spending time with someone who wasn't me. Where is she? I demanded, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound strong. She's safe, he replied, his lips curling into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. For now. What do you want? I asked, my fists clenching at my sides. He chuckled, a low, chilling sound. You don't understand your place, do you? You're nothing, Daniel. A speck of dirt on the shoes of people like me. And yet, somehow, you've managed to pull her away from the life she was destined for. I didn't pull her away from anything, I shot back. She came to me because you couldn't give her what she needed. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure fury. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think you can win, don't you? That love conquers all, or some other foolish notion. She's not a prize to be won, I said, my voice steady now. She's a person. And she deserves to choose for herself. For a moment, he stared at me, his jaw tightening. Then he nodded, as if coming to a decision. You're right, he said. She does deserve to choose. But let me make one thing clear, you're not part of her future. Before I could respond, he motioned to the driver, who opened the car door. Olivia stepped out, her face pale and eyes red-rimmed. She looked at me, her gaze filled with a mixture of love, fear, and regret. Olivia, I said, taking a step toward her. Don't, Jonathan warned, his tone sharp. She shook her head, her voice trembling. Daniel, I'm so sorry. Sorry for what? I asked, panic rising in my chest. For this, she whispered, her tears spilling over. He knows everything. He threatened my family, Daniel. My father's business, my mother's reputation, everything they've built. If I don't go back to him, he'll destroy them. I looked at her, my heart breaking into pieces. You don't have to do this, I said, desperation clawing at my throat. We can leave. Run away together. Start fresh somewhere else. Her lips quivered, and for a moment, I thought she might say yes. But then her gaze shifted to Jonathan, who stood like a sentinel of power and control, and I saw the defeat in her eyes. I can't, she said, her voice barely audible. I can't let him hurt the people I love. You love me, I said, my voice cracking. Isn't that enough? She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she touched my face. I do love you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. But sometimes love isn't enough. I felt the weight of her words crush me as she pulled away, her touch lingering like a ghost. Jonathan smirked, satisfied with his victory, and guided her back toward the car. Don't do this, Olivia. I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty street. She hesitated, turning back one last time. Goodbye, Daniel, she said, tears streaming down her face. The car door closed, and the engine roared to life. I watched helplessly as the vehicle disappeared into the night, taking her with it. For a long time, I stood there, the cold seeping into my bones. The world felt empty, hollow, as if all the color had drained from it. I thought about chasing after her, fighting for her, but deep down, I knew it was over. She had made her choice, not because she didn't love me, but because the weight of her world was too much for us to overcome. Months passed, and life went on, though I was a shadow of the man I had been. I went back to my corner on Elmwood Avenue, blending into the background of a city that never stopped moving. But I carried her with me, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her touch, the memory of a love that burned too bright to last. And though I would never see her again, I knew she would always be a part of me. Because sometimes, the greatest love stories aren't the ones that end in happily ever after. They're the ones that leave a mark on your soul, a scar that reminds you of what it means to feel truly alive. In the end, Olivia didn't just change my life. She became my story.